At a Sunday morning testimony meeting, Jill stood up, took the microphone from the usher, and began to speak to the congregation. I want to share the story of the terrible accident my husband Jim suffered this past month. He was out riding his Harley, lost control, veered off the highway, and crashed into a tree. He was rushed to the hospital, and it could have been much worse, but thank the Lord, the only injury he sustained was a broken scrotum. The congregation gasped. The men squirmed in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the thought of such an injury. Jim has been in excruciating pain ever since. He has trouble breathing, trouble swallowing food, and he can barely lift anything. He hasn't been able to work. He can't hold our children and give them the love they need. And worst of all, we can no longer cuddle or be intimate. Our relationship has been severely affected, and I ask for your prayers that Jim's broken scrotum heals soon and he can return to normal. A hushed murmur swept through the congregation as they processed the gravity of the situation. The men were clearly rattled, thinking, "That could have been me." Then, from the back of the church, a figure slowly stood, made his way to the pulpit, clearly in discomfort, adjusted the microphone, and leaned in to speak. "My name is Jim," he said, "and I have just one thing to say to my wife, Jill. Sternum." Jennifer's wedding day was fast approaching, and nothing could dampen her excitement, not even the messy divorce of her parents. Her mother had found the perfect dress to wear and was determined to be the best-dressed mother of the bride ever. But a week before the wedding, Jennifer was horrified to learn that her father's new young wife had bought the exact same dress. Jennifer asked her father's new wife to exchange it, but she refused. "Absolutely not! I look like $1,000,000 in this dress, and I'm wearing it," she insisted. Jennifer, flustered, told her mother, who graciously replied, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll just find another dress. After all, it's your special day." A few days later, Jennifer and her mother found another stunning dress for her mother to wear. After their shopping trip, they stopped for lunch. Jennifer hesitated before asking, "Aren't you going to return the other dress? You won't really need it for anything else." Her mother smiled and replied, "Oh, don't worry, dear. I'll wear it to the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding." A man finds himself stranded on a deserted island after a shipwreck. For 10 long years, he's been all alone, surviving on whatever he can find. Then one day, he spots something in the distance. "It's probably not a ship," he thinks to himself. No ships have ever come near the island. As it draws nearer, he starts to rule out every possibility. It's not a small boat, not a raft. To his amazement, a beautiful blonde woman emerges from the surf, wearing scuba gear and a wetsuit. She walks up to him, and he can hardly believe his eyes. She tells him she has a boat nearby and just went for a swim. The sight of him in such a poor state fills her with sympathy. "Tell me," she asks, "how long has it been since you've had a cigarette?" The man replies, 10 years. With that, the woman opens a waterproof pocket on her sleeve and hands him a pack of cigarettes. He takes one, lights it, and exhales with a satisfied sigh. "This is incredible." "And how long has it been since you've had a drink of bourbon?" she asks. 10 years, he says, his voice trembling. She pulls out a flask, hands it to him, and he takes a deep swig. "This is the best day of my life," he exclaims. The woman slowly begins unzipping her wetsuit, her eyes locking with his in a playful way. "Now, how long has it been since you've had some real fun?" she asks, her voice low and teasing. With tears in his eyes, the man drops to his knees, overwhelmed. "Please, tell me you've got a game of Twister in there." An atheist, frustrated by the constant celebrations of Christmas and other religious holidays, filed a lawsuit claiming that atheists had no holiday to celebrate. The case was brought before a judge. After listening to the atheist's lawyer's impassioned argument, the judge slammed his gavel and declared, "Case dismissed." The lawyer quickly stood up and objected. "Your Honor, how can you dismiss this case? Christians have Christmas, Easter, and numerous other holidays. Jews celebrate Passover, Yom Kippur, and Hanukkah, but my client and all other atheists have nothing." The judge leaned forward in his chair and calmly replied, "Clearly your client is too confused to recognize, let alone celebrate, his own holiday." The lawyer, puffing out his chest, retorted, "Your Honor, we are unaware of any such holiday for atheists. When would it be?" The judge smirked and said, "Well, it happens every year on the same day. Psalm 14:1 states, 'The fool says in his heart, there is no God.' So according to the Bible, if your client denies the existence of God, then he is a fool. April Fool's Day. That's his holiday. Now get out of my courtroom." One day, a man was driving down a winding road when suddenly a bunny darted across his path. Despite his best efforts to stop, he hit the bunny head-on. Panicked, the man quickly jumped out of his car to check the scene. There, lying motionless in the middle of the road, was the Easter bunny. "Oh, no!" the man cried. "I've committed a terrible crime. I've run over the Easter bunny." Overcome with guilt, he sobbed uncontrollably. Just then, another car pulled up, a woman in a red convertible. She stopped and asked what had happened. The man explained, "I've done something horrible. I've run over the Easter bunny. Now there won't be any eggs delivered on Easter. It's all my fault." Without missing a beat, the woman ran back to her car, returning moments later with a spray bottle. She sprayed the bunny, and to the man's amazement, the bunny instantly sprang to life, hopped into the woods, stopped, and waved back at them. The bunny then continued hopping, stopping every few feet to wave until it was out of sight. Stunned, the man turned to the woman and asked, "What was that stuff in the bottle?" The woman smiled and replied, "It's hairspray. It revitalizes hair and adds a permanent wave." A man worked at the post office, sorting through mail with illegible addresses. One day he came across a letter addressed simply to God with no return address. Curious, he opened it to see what it contained. The letter read, "Dear God, I am an 83-year-old widow living on a very small pension. Yesterday, someone stole my purse. It had $100 in it, my entire savings until my next check. Christmas is next Sunday, and I had invited 2 friends over for dinner. Without that money, I won't be able to buy food. I have no family to turn to, and you're my only hope. Please help me. Sincerely, Edna." Moved by her plea, the postal worker shared the letter with his colleagues. Each one reached into their wallets and contributed what they could. By the time he'd made the rounds, they had gathered $96, which was placed in an envelope and sent to Edna. That day, the team felt a warm, shared glow knowing they'd made a real difference in someone's life. Christmas came and went. A few days later, another letter arrived from Edna. The workers eagerly gathered around as it was opened. The letter read, "Dear God, how can I ever thank you enough for your wonderful gift? Because of your kindness, I was able to prepare a beautiful dinner for my friends. We had a lovely day, and I told them all about your generosity. By the way, though, there was $4 missing. I'm pretty sure it was those bastards at the post office." On her 70th birthday, a little old lady checked into a motel. She was feeling a bit lonely, so she thought, why not call one of those escort services I've seen advertised in the phone book? Maybe I could use a little company. After flipping through the pages, she found a full-page ad for a guy named Tender Tony. His photo showed a ridiculously handsome man with muscles in all the right places. Thick, wavy hair, a dazzling smile, 6-pack abs, and legs that looked like they could run a marathon. She was certain she could bounce a quarter off his perfectly sculpted rear end. She thought, what the heck, nobody will ever know, and dialed the number. "Good evening, ma'am. How may I assist you?" His voice was smooth and sensual, and the old lady's heart skipped a beat. Feeling a surge of boldness, she dove right in. "Hi, I hear you give amazing massages. I'd love for you to come to my room and give me one. No, wait, let me be clear. I'm here all alone, and what I really want is... ****. I want it hot, I want it wild, and I want it now. Bring everything you've got. Rubber, leather, whips, chains, chocolate syrup, whipped cream. Let's go all in. Tie me up, cover me in everything, and let's make tonight unforgettable." There was a brief pause before Tony's voice came back, calm and collected. "That sounds absolutely thrilling, madam, but you'll need to press 9 for an outside line." A farmer took his truck in for repairs, but the mechanic couldn't fix it right away. Since he didn't live too far, he decided to walk home. Along the way, he stopped at the hardware store and bought a bucket and a gallon of paint. He then swung by the feed store to pick up a couple of chickens and a goose. But now, with all his purchases in tow, he found himself in a bit of a pickle. How was he going to carry everything? As he stood there scratching his head, a little old lady approached him and asked, "Excuse me, sir, could you tell me how to get to 1603 Mockingbird Lane?" "Well," the farmer replied, "I live just down the road from there. I'd be happy to walk you there, but I'm in a bit of a situation with all these things I'm carrying. Why don't you put the paint can in the bucket, carry the bucket in one hand, tuck a chicken under each arm, and hold the goose in your other hand?" suggested the old lady. "Why, thank you," the farmer said, following her advice and loading up with all his purchases. "I'll walk you home then." As they made their way down the street, the farmer said, "Let's take the shortcut down this alley. It'll be quicker." The little old lady hesitated, giving him a wary look. "I'm a widow with no husband to protect me. How do I know that when we get to the alley, you won't push me up against the wall, lift my skirt, and take advantage of me?" The farmer was taken aback. "Holy smokes, lady, I'm carrying a bucket, a gallon of paint, 2 chickens, and a goose. How could I possibly do that?" The old lady raised an eyebrow and replied, "Well, if you were to do such a thing, you'd have to set the goose down, cover it with the bucket, put the paint on top, and I'd hold the chickens." Ned and his buddy Carl decided to take a golfing trip to Scotland, so they packed up Ned's minivan and hit the road. After a few hours of driving, they were caught in a brutal blizzard and decided to seek shelter at a nearby farm. An attractive woman answered the door, and they asked if they could spend the night. "I'd love to help," she said, "but I'm a recent widow, and I'm afraid the neighbors might gossip if I let you stay inside. The weather's terrible, though, and I live in this huge house all by myself." "Don't worry about it," Ned reassured her. "We'll be fine in the barn, and we'll be gone first thing in the morning when the weather clears." The woman agreed, so the two men made their way to the barn and settled in for the night. The next morning, the storm had passed, and they were back on the road. 2 years later, Ned received a letter from an attorney. After a few minutes of puzzling over it, he realized it was from the widow's attorney, someone he hadn't thought about in a long time. He quickly called up Carl. "Hey, Carl," Ned began. "Do you remember that farm we stayed at 2 years ago during our golf trip to Scotland? The one with the widow?" "Of course I do," Carl replied. "How could I forget?" "Well, did you, happen to visit the widow in the middle of the night while I was sleeping in the barn?" Carl paused, looking sheepish. "Well, yeah, I did. I might have gotten a little lonely, and I went to her house for a chat. Why? Did you by chance give her a false name?" Carl turned bright red. Yeah, I did. Look, I panicked a bit, and I may have told her your name. Why? What's going on?" Ned smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Because I just got a letter from her attorney. She passed away and left me everything. I'm rich now, my friend." An elderly lady walked into a Bank of America branch carrying a huge bag of cash. She approached the receptionist and said she wanted to meet the president of the bank to deposit a large sum of money. The receptionist tried to turn her away, but the woman insisted, refusing to budge. With no other choice, the receptionist went inside and returned shortly, saying, "You're in luck today. The president will see you." In the president's office, he asked, "How can I help you, madam?" The old lady replied, "I'd like to open a new account and deposit this money." He raised an eyebrow. "How much money are we talking about?" $180,000, she said as she dumped the entire amount onto his desk. The bank president, a little taken aback, asked, "Where did you get all this cash?" "We're not a money laundering facility, you know." The old lady smiled. "Oh, it's all perfectly legal. I make bets." "Bets?" The president raised an eyebrow. "What kind of bets?" "For example, I bet you that your right hand will taste like eggs, but your left hand won't. If I'm right, you owe me $25,000. If I'm wrong, I'll give you $10,000. The president, utterly confused but intrigued by the challenge, agreed. You're on, but I don't even like eggs. How is this even possible? She assured him she'd be back the next day with her lawyer to make sure everything went smoothly. He spent the whole night nervously licking his hands and sniffing them, trying to figure out if they really smelled like eggs. The next morning, right at 9 a.m., the old lady and her lawyer arrived at the bank. She said, "Can I check your hands now, sir?" "Of course," he said, nervous but eager to win. The old lady held his right hand, sniffed it, and then licked it briefly to confirm. Meanwhile, her lawyer started banging his head against the wall. The president, feeling victorious and relieved that he didn't lose the bet, asked, "What's wrong with your lawyer? Why is he so upset?" The lawyer, still in shock, muttered, "I had a bet with her, too, for $100,000. I can't believe I lost. She told me she would be licking the hands of the President of Bank of America at 9 a.m. today." Some time ago, a man had two sons. As they grew older, it was clear that Jackson was sharp as a tack, while Blake was about as sharp as a spoon. Despite their differences, both sons were loved and cared for dearly. Eventually, the father fell ill and passed away. Jackson, always the responsible one, called Blake and said, "Listen, I have an incredibly important business meeting to attend, but I'll catch the first flight home. Here are my credit card details. Make sure Dad looks his absolute best and gets everything money can buy for his funeral. Spare no expense." Though Jackson wasn't entirely sure Blake could handle such an important task, well, because he was Blake, he had no one else to turn to. Surprisingly, Blake took care of everything and did so within a reasonable budget. Jackson was pleasantly surprised, and the funeral went smoothly, though it was a sad and emotional time for everyone. A few months later, Jackson calls Blake again. "Hey, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I noticed there's about $300 charged to my card every month. Could you explain that?" Blake, feeling insulted, replied, "Of course not. I'd never steal from you, you know that." Jackson, still puzzled, said, "I know, I just don't get it. So what do you say about these charges?" Blake paused for a moment and then answered, "Oh, those? Those are for Dad's tux. You told me to make sure he looked his best, so I rented the most expensive suit in town." A golfer was playing in Ireland when he hooked his drive deep into the woods. While searching for his ball, he stumbled upon a little leprechaun, flat on his back with a big bump on his head, and his golf ball right beside him. Horrified, the golfer quickly grabbed his water bottle from the cart and poured some on the leprechaun to revive him. "Oh, what happened?" The leprechaun groaned. "I'm so sorry," the golfer said. "I think I hit you with my golf ball." The leprechaun rubbed his head and smiled. "Oh, I see. Well, you got old Patty here fair and square. You get 3 wishes. What's it going to be?" "Thank God you're all right," the golfer replied, still in shock. "I don't want anything. I'm just glad you're okay. Really, I apologize." The golfer walked off, leaving the little leprechaun stunned by his kindness. "Wow, what a nice guy," Patty thought to himself. "I've got to do something for him." So he granted the golfer 3 gifts, a fantastic golf game, all the money he would ever need, and a great love life. A year later, the golfer returned to Ireland. On the same hole, he hit another wayward drive into the woods, and there, waiting for him, was the leprechaun. "'Twas me that made you hit the ball here again," the leprechaun said with a grin. "Tell me, how's your golf game?" "My game is fantastic," the golfer responded. "I'm an internationally famous golfer now." The leprechaun nodded. "Good for ye. And how's your money?" "Fantastic," the golfer replied cheerfully. "Whenever I need cash, I just reach into my pocket, and there are $100 bills I didn't even know I had." The leprechaun chuckled. "I did that for you, too. And how's your love life?" The golfer blushed, looking away. It's okay." The leprechaun leaned in, eager for more details. "Come on now, tell me, how many times a week do you do the deed?" Blushing even harder, the golfer whispered, "Once, sometimes twice a week." "What?" The leprechaun gasped in disbelief. "Only once or twice a week?" The golfer, clearly embarrassed, looked around and replied, "Well, I figure it's not bad for a Catholic priest in a small parish." An elderly woman brought her husband to the doctor for a checkup. After examining him, the doctor took his pulse, looked up at the woman, and said, "I'm sorry, your husband is dead." The woman was in shock. "Are you sure? Can you double-check? Are there any other tests you can do to be absolutely certain?" she asked. The doctor, clearly confident, said, "Well, if you want absolute certainty, we can perform some additional tests." "Yes, please, I need to be absolutely sure," she insisted. The doctor shrugged, walked over to the door, and called out, "Send in Mrs. Fluffkins." In walked a black house cat, who jumped onto the examination table and casually walked over the husband's body. The cat swatted at his face a few times, meowed twice, and hopped off the table. The doctor nodded. "Just as I thought. Dead. Send in Walter." In came a large Labrador retriever who sniffed the husband's hand, looked up at the doctor with wide eyes, and shook his head before walking out. The doctor smiled. "Yep, dead. Now send in Colin." Suddenly, a towering Aussie burst into the room, wearing safari gear and binoculars around his neck. He took a quick glance at the husband, then turned to the woman and yelled, "Oi, BCH, your husband's foin dead," and marched out. The doctor made a note on his clipboard. "Thank you, Colin. Now, ma'am, could you come in here?" An elderly woman with thick glasses walked into the room. She peered at the body, then sat down at a typewriter in the corner. A few seconds later, she clacked away at the keys, pulled out a card, and handed it to the doctor. He looked at the card, then at the woman. "Dead. Thank you, ma'am. That'll be all." Just then, the doctor grabbed his stool, lifted it above his head, and swung it down onto the husband's body with a crash. The body jerked a little and then settled back. The doctor made one final note on his clipboard. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your husband is definitely dead." He handed her a sheet of paper with the test results. "Take this to the front desk for checkout." At the front desk, the receptionist looked at the paper, gave the woman a sympathetic glance, and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss. That will be $32,000. $32,000? Huh," the woman exclaimed. "That's ridiculous. I've never paid that much for a doctor's visit." The receptionist nodded and said, "Well, it's a $100 copay for the visit, but it looks like you also requested a CAT scan, a lab report, a colonoscopy, a mammogram, and a stool analysis." An old miser, known for his extreme cheapness, was nearing the end of his life. With no family or friends, he called upon his doctor, lawyer, and minister to come to his bedside. They arrived, gathered around him, and listened as he spoke. "I've always heard that you can't take it with you," he said weakly. "But I am going to prove you can. I have $90,000 in cash hidden under my mattress in 3 envelopes of $30,000 each. I want each of you to take one envelope now, and just before they bury me, throw it into my grave. That way I can take it with me." Weeks later, at the funeral, the doctor, lawyer, and minister dutifully tossed their envelopes into the grave. On the way back to the car, the minister turned to the others and said, "I must confess I needed $10,000 to help fund a new church project, so I took $10,000 out of the envelope and only threw in $20,000. The doctor, looking guilty, said, "I, too, must confess. I'm building a new clinic, and I took $20,000 from the envelope, leaving only $10,000 behind." The lawyer, shocked, looked at the other two and said, "Gentlemen, I am appalled. How could you take that money? I'm ashamed of you both. I threw in a personal check for the full $30,000. One day, a girl and Johnny went for a walk in the woods. It was quiet, they were alone, and the moment felt just right. For the first time, she reached over and boldly held his package. Feeling adventurous, she leaned in and kissed it gently. Suddenly, a few drops came out of Johnny's, Surprised, the girl pulled back and asked, "What is this?" Blushing deeply, Johnny gave her a shy smile and said, "Those are tears of joy." A soap factory had a problem. Occasionally, they shipped empty boxes without the soap inside, which hurt their reputation with buyers and distributors. The CEO knew the importance of maintaining good relationships, so he gathered his best people to tackle the issue. After 6 months and a hefty $8 million investment, they came up with a solution that was on time, on budget, and met the highest standards. They installed a special scale that would sound a bell and flashlights whenever a soapbox weighed less than it should. The line would stop and someone would come over to remove the defective box, then press a button to restart the line. Thanks to this new system, no empty boxes were shipped out, and everything seemed to be running smoothly. A few weeks later, the CEO decided to check the first week's report. Since the new system had been installed, no empty boxes had been sent out. The report showed about a dozen defective boxes being removed each day, which matched the projections. There were nearly 0 customer complaints, and they were even gaining market share. The CEO thought the $8 million investment was money well spent. However, after 3 weeks, the report showed 0 defective boxes being picked up. Puzzled, the CEO filed a bug report. The engineers investigated and came back with surprising news. The report was correct. There were no defects because all the boxes arriving at the scales were good. Curious, the CEO went down to the factory to check the system for himself. Standing near the scale, he observed that just ahead of the $8 million solution was a $20 desk fan blowing the empty boxes off the belt and into a bin. Confused, the CEO asked the line supervisor about it. "Oh, that," the supervisor said. "Bert, the kid from maintenance, put it there. He was tired of walking over to remove the defective boxes every time the bell rang." Matt and his wife lived in the country, and Matt was notoriously stingy. He hated spending money. One day, a fair came to the nearby town. "Let's go to the fair, Matt," his wife suggested. "We haven't been anywhere for ages." Matt thought about it for a while. He knew he'd have to spend money at the fair, but finally he said, "All right, but I'm not going to spend much. We'll look around, but we won't buy anything." They went to the fair and looked at all the things to buy. Matt's wife saw many things she wanted, but Matt refused to let her buy anything. Then, in a nearby field, they saw a small old airplane with a sign that said, "Fun flight, $20 for 10 minutes. Matt had never been in an airplane and thought it sounded exciting, but he didn't want to pay for his wife, too. "I've only got $20, he told the pilot. "Can my wife come with me for free?" The pilot, not selling many tickets, thought for a moment and said, "I'll make a deal with you. If neither of you screams or shouts during the flight, you don't have to pay for her." Matt agreed, and they both climbed into the small airplane. The pilot took off and performed all sorts of crazy stunts, loop-de-loops, sharp dives, fast turns, everything to try to scare them. But they stayed completely silent, not a word. Finally, the pilot landed and said, "Well, you both did it. You never made a sound, so your wife rides for free." "Thanks," Matt replied, but it wasn't easy, especially when she fell out. On a hot afternoon, Scrooge the miser and his grandson, Tim, were walking home from a party. Tim, tired and sweaty, complained, "Gramps, it's so far to our house, and I'm so hot. Look, there's a bus stop. Can we take the bus?" Scrooge frowned, aghast. $6 to get home? What a waste of money. We'll walk." Tim sighed, but didn't argue. They barely walked a few feet before Scrooge spotted a passing taxi and hailed it. "How much to take us to Springfield Avenue?" he asked the driver. "Springfield Avenue? About $20, the driver replied. Scrooge scoffed. "Too much. We won't be needing your services, thank you." As the taxi drove off, Tim turned to his grandfather, confused. "Gramps, did you really think a taxi to Springfield Avenue would cost less than the bus?" "Don't be ridiculous," Scrooge replied. "I knew it wouldn't." "Then why did you flag down the taxi?" Tim asked incredulously. Scrooge grinned. "Simple, boy. We'd save $6 by walking instead of taking the bus. Now we're saving 20 by not taking the taxi." Timothy was a bright young boy with a big heart, though he'd always been a bit self-conscious. After a fishing accident when he was younger, he lost one of his eyes, and his family couldn't afford a glass one, so his grandfather carved him a wooden one instead. Timothy was teased relentlessly about it all through school, and it took a toll on his confidence. But with the school dance coming up, Timothy was determined not to let his insecurities hold him back. He had his eye on a girl named Sally who, despite being shy, had a kind heart. She had a pronounced mustache, which earned her the nickname Hair Lip, but Timothy saw beyond that and thought she was the most beautiful girl in school. One day, he spotted her sitting alone in the lunchroom eating a peanut butter sandwich. This was his chance. Timothy walked over to her, heart pounding. "Sally," he said, "I've been seeing you around for a while and, well, would you like to go to the dance with me?" Sally's eyes lit up with surprise and excitement. "Would I?" she exclaimed. Timothy, feeling overwhelmed by his nerves, blurted out, "Hair Lip!" and ran off as fast as he could.